Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about From Dusk Till Dawn from 1996. From Dusk Till Dawn was kind of a favorite of mine growing up because it was the mid-90s and everyone was sort of Tarantino obsessed, and there really weren't that many titles to see. It's kind of like Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, True Romance, Four Rooms. That's it. Sorry. It's not like now when there's, a lot more movies. So when you heard of From Dusk Till Dawn, especially if you were a movie-obsessed teenager, that was sort of right up your alley. And it was a film I watched a lot on Halloween. I know it's not a straight horror film, but this was kind of a personal Halloween favorite. For whatever reason, my parents would not let me see Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs when I was in my early teens, but I could see this. Some of their ratings things never made sense, but they let me rent this. I don't know. And oftentimes what would happen, we'd have Halloween parties at the house, and I was able to go to Blockbuster and I would get to rent a VCR because they were using the other one maybe or something. My friends and I would watch From Dusk Till Dawn and Clerks, usually, which isn't a horror movie, and Evil Dead 2 or something in the basement at the crappier TV. And From Dusk Till Dawn was pretty much always there because it's fun, it was very 90s, it was very violent, and there were vampires in it, so, Halloween. And I have always looked at this as kind of the fun, lighter Tarantino movie, and you might say, hey, it's not lighter, there's violence and really icky stuff in it, but in terms of going deep into film theory and really thinking about the characters and thinking about all the things, I've never really looked at From Dusk Till Dawn like that. It's just kind of a fun movie that switches completely midway through and has lots of violence and still has the quirky dialogue and stuff like that. It was mostly mainly trying to be kind of like a fun, ridiculous kind of cult movie, and that's what I've always really liked about it. Now, I would watch this movie a lot just because it was I wanted to watch a Tarantino thing. Pulp Fiction always felt like a big experience, but sometimes you don't want to have a huge meal, and so I would put this on probably way too much. I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I watched it every Halloween other than I was having a good time, and that seemed to be sort of enough with it. And this is a good time of a movie. Sure, the thing with this movie is it's sort of one movie, this heist road movie thing, and then it becomes the vampire thing. I've never heard him say yeah, I was stuck, I had writer's block, and then I switched it to another thing. That's what everyone supposed, I guess, or that he had written half a screenplay and then sort of made it into this, because he did write this for hire for Robert Kurtzman, who was considering directing but ended up not wanting to or something, and then Tarantino asked Robert Rodriguez to direct this film. Robert Kurtzman, who is a well-regarded special effects makeup guy, and mainly did this. He came up with the story. I don't know how much of the story he came up with. That I should really find some interviews or something. I couldn't really find much about the development of this, but since there's such a debate on it, I would sort of like that clarified at some point. But Robert Kurtzman apparently came up with the story. He thought about directing because he had done a lot of stuff with John Carpenter and a bunch of different kind of horror and sci-fi things from the 80s and 90s and up to the 2010s. He thought about directing it but didn't, and then obviously Tarantino got a lot hotter and apparently was considered to be at one point the second film in the Tales from the Crypt franchise, but they went with Bordello of Blood, and supposedly Tony Scott was interested and other directors were interested. I find very little on that. That seems a little unconfirmable, but Tarantino apparently took the script and went to Robert Rodriguez and was like, hey, would you like to make this? And in a way, it's perfect for Rodriguez's sensibilities. I kind of have always looked at this as topper tier Robert Rodriguez. This was actually not a huge hit, but enough of it made about the same as Desperado. I've always heard it kind of didn't do amazingly. It opened at number one. I think it made a couple 100,000 more than Desperado, which is surprising because I've always thought of Desperado as being the one that made more than this, but apparently that wasn't true. When I looked at box office figures, I was like, oh, didn't know that. I thought this opened at 7th and was a cult thing, but it opened at 1 and was a cult thing. I mean, and it makes sense. It had George Clooney when he was hot. It had Tarantino when he was really hot, Harvey Keitel, Juliette Lewis, Fred Williamson, Tom Savini, Cheech Marin. It had a great cast. Of course, people are going to check this thing out. But I kind of knew about this because when I was still trick-or-treating, any older kids who were in charge of trick-or-treating, Halloween of 96, which I'm assuming this was on VHS at that point, but that's kind of how I remember it, would have this on TV in the background. And I was like, whoa, this movie seems crazy. And I just saw like from the door and like kind of like peer in as they close the door. They're like, I don't know you, please don't look into my house. And I remember just like all the cooler older kids like were like, this is so cool, you know, I like From Dusk Till Dawn. And it was kind of like worked within this was a hit before Scream, which would sort of change the 90s horror, which would happen at the end of 96, was right before. And this kind of goes into like, let's do a 90s sensibility but with horror, which didn't seem to meld that well. This melds really well with like Tarantino's whole thing and Robert Rodriguez's whole thing, when those guys were like, you know, total legends at the time, and it totally works within that while still being like a violent horror film. It's not really scary, you know? I mean, it is kind of like a hybrid horror crime sort of film, or vampire crime or whatever. But I don't think I'm scared by it. It's more like a crime film with horror elements, but I think that was sort of good enough and cool enough. I just remember thinking this was like such a cool movie, and like how did I get to see this and all this stuff, you know. I probably overwatched it because I could see a movie that was really violent. And I think that's why a lot of people see it. I don't have problems with the two tones of it, because I've always, when I watch it, I'm always like, well, you have to set up all these people before you like rip them to shreds. I mean, whether Tarantino did write another script and then like just tack this stuff on to appease Robert Kurtzman, I don't know. I do like that his company, he formed a company called KNB EFX Group. Its title in the opening credits happens when Tarantino is looking through the hole in his hand, which I thought was like, oh, clever guys. But you did kind of help get this movie made, so I guess you deserve it. But it was still like, okay. I love the opening kind of a convenience store thing. I really like. It's probably the most Tarantino of the whole movie. It really does. I mean, it obviously is, but it really becomes a Tarantino film directed by Robert Rodriguez. But then in the moments where, especially like they're going on these long monologues and setting up, you know, mood, and having the cop and the guy behind the convenience store talk, and, you know, various like dialogue Olympics and things like that, then it felt very Tarantino. And then when George Clooney and Tarantino are walking away from the convenience store when it's exploding, I thought that's a pretty cool touch. There's a lot of times where it felt like this Robert Rodriguez can't really like have as much confidence in his directing. He doesn't hold on these like long tracking shots. Even the walking away part, I mean, I guarantee you like it was more because the explosions, it was probably hard to hear dialogue, but there a lot of times there's these explosions, and I wish, you know, that's a tricky and expensive shot to do, and I think they did a good job with it. But there are a lot of times where I notice like he'll do fades and stuff and not have the confidence of the camera that Tarantino has, and it is fairly obvious this is a film written by Tarantino, not directed by him. The Robert Rodriguez-Tarantino relationship has always been an interesting one, because I think Tarantino is like an amazing, like interesting filmmaker who takes the influences of B movies and makes something wholly original and different with it, and understands all these things and fuses them together and does these amazing things with dialogue, and can make really mature statements with it. And Robert Rodriguez is sort of just a really good B movie director. There's people like Roger Corman, and then there's people who are amazingly awesome directors who worked with Roger Corman, and I think Robert Rodriguez is more Roger Corman. But I think that's also why Tarantino likes him, because those are the people he is interested in. So of course, like having an actual guy like that direct one of his screenplays, I think sort of made total sense. You know, this is almost going through the gleefulness of cult horror and kind of grindhouse thing. This almost works better than actual grindhouse, you know, their actual grindhouse movies, although I still think the whole entire experience of grindhouse is something that's sort of one of a kind, but you actually can't get that on Blu-ray or streaming or anything, which is bullshit. It's interesting because it's such a film that's made to be a cult movie, and it's right before, in the 2000s, post Snakes on a Plane, that became a total thing, but total thing in an obnoxious way. Like, they totally knew how to market it, and a lot of those films didn't feel like genuine. Like, they, you know, like Drive Angry is always the one I'm putting out, or Snakes on a Plane, or things, you know. I think the best one was Piranha 3D, but From Dusk Till Dawn just sort of definitely knows it's going to be a cult movie and plays it in such a fun way. And there are so many things, like it plays with its 90s ridiculous dialogue when George Clooney's just flapping his mouth like fucking crazy, and he's like, you know, do you believe in vampires? I don't believe in vampires thing is actually pretty funny. And I do hear from people, because I experienced this much more when it was a current film, believe it or not. I'm that old, and when I talk to people now, they're more surprised, like when it switches, or like when they watch it on TV, they go, oh, Tarantino, oh, it's a vampire movie, what the fuck. But I like sort of knew that going in, And I was fine with, like, because I was really thirsty or hungry or however we're calling it nowadays, for Tarantino stuff. I've always been sort of fine with it being that way and then getting into it. And then, by the time I heard people complain about it, I'd rewatch it and go, I don't know, I'm sort of just used to the way this movie flows. So I've never really had that complaint. I understand that complaint. It's a complaint that makes total sense. That you're like, why the fuck did it suddenly like switch up and change mid-movie? That's a little weird. George Clooney's actually really good in this. I'm surprised he didn't do this kind of like fast-talking kind of con man kind of thing a lot. He does it in more of a reserved way in the Ocean's films and Out of Sight and things like that. Tarantino, I mean, I don't think anyone's like in love with Tarantino as an actor. I know he has acted. He was doing a lot more acting in the 90s. He did like Wait Until Dark, the play version of it. I know he did like a thing on Alias even. He did some stuff, and this is probably like one of the more fondly remembered ones where he's playing like this kind of creepy dude. He's playing more of a role and less of a Quentin Tarantino. So I will say this is probably the most range he ever showed. He was more on there because he was such a visible face. He was on so many talk shows. He was on so many magazine covers. He could really sell a movie. I mean, he did sell this movie. It was pretty much like, he's in this movie, he wrote this movie, he produced this movie, or executive produced it or whatever, and his buddy directed it. I've liked the gleeful violence of this. I'm not gonna say like, if you're not ready to have a cold beer and watch a cold movie kind of person, then this movie's not for you. I always had it on at parties and would talk over it. When I was watching it by myself, I was like, this just doesn't feel the same, but it's sort of hard to like watch a movie and chill with someone and try to review it, so I don't for the purposes of making this review, I couldn't have done that, but I've done that a lot of times. I wasn't drinking cold beer when I was like 14. It was more just like Barks root beer probably or something, and we probably drank way too much soda. But when we did drink a lot of soda, we felt like we were really cool. Well, we were talking over it and doing Simpsons quotes, and I'm sure some of this between From Dusk Till Dawn were Treehouse of Horrors, and we were like, oh, awesome violence and Tarantino, who everyone was into. And I think under that, guys, I get why this movie was such a thing in the 90s and was sort of like a horror hit, at least in my town where I grew up, that Halloween. And I remember seeing it in a few houses and just going like, those kids are cool. We gotta watch this movie. I don't know who those kids are. I could not name them even at the time. But I was Tarantino obsessed. Most of culture was a little Tarantino obsessed. It didn't really die down until Jackie Brown, and everyone's like, oh, he made a thoughtful movie. Let's not think about him anymore. Although I love Jackie Brown. I think it's great. It's interesting, how it really plays off of the ultra violence kind of thing that he was so kind of associated with, even though I don't think Pulp Fiction does that as much as like other movies or anything. But with this movie, I think it leans so heavily into that in such a gleeful way. There's certain 90s things I read about a lot of the reviews for this. Like, there's a lot of people who want to be over violent and don't seem to have as much fun with it as these guys do. Even people who gave negative reviews were like, I don't know, it seems like they were having a lot of fun making these action sequences. And at the time, I think a lot of mainstream stuff was either really serious about its action sequences or wouldn't have as much fun as this, and weren't going to cast like Fred Williamson and Cheech Marin and Danny Trejo and before you really knew who he was kind of thing, and have fun with like these kind of cult figures. It was like he picked them out of a horror convention or something and they were having fun with it. I think that energy comes through in this one. They're still young enough that it's still fun and fresh, and they're not overdoing it with the references. I probably enjoy this personally and think this is a much better movie than actually either of the Grindhouse films. I think it just gets into that film dork energy of let's make a movie and do all these crazy things and have Big Kahuna Burger in it and have all these weird stuff and have the kid wearing a Precinct 13 shirt and just like be obvious about it, but it somehow doesn't sort of annoy me in this time. It just is like kind of a fun, ridiculous, gory crime horror kind of weird hybrid very 90s kind of movie, and that's what I've always sort of enjoyed about it. And watching From Dusk Till Dawn, I kind of remember all those awesome times and watching all these people bathe in vampire blood while they blow them the fuck away. So if you would like to talk about From Dusk Till Dawn, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.